Not only is The Princess Bride one of the greatest love stories ever told, but it also repeated one of the greatest pieces of foreign policy advice given by Douglas MacArthur after the Korean War. He said that the United States should never again be involved in a land war in Asia. Welcome to Vietnam and the Cold War. Now, the Vietnam War, when did it start? When did it end? That's a very complicated question because Vietnam took on so many wars between the years of 1940 to 1991 that it's hard to keep track. They fought Japan, they fought France, they fought the United States, they fought Cambodia, and they fought China. And they defeated them all. So, how did the United States become involved in Vietnam? First, we must look back on the deep psychological effect that this had on Americans. This was their first defeat, and it was kind of a shameful or very controversial period in American history. So they still have commemorations in Washington, D.C., despite this controversy. Here is a statue of three American soldiers to commemorate their sacrifices. And later in Washington, D.C., at the actual memorial, they have the names of around 60,000 U.S. troops that were killed or are still missing as a result of the Vietnam War. Now, how did they become involved? Pictured here in the dark gray is French Indochina. Indochina was a French colony. And after the Second World War, as we've talked about with the process of decolonialization, a lot of these places wanted to become free and rule themselves. There was a massive struggle between the Vietnamese and the French for the control of Indochina, and the French lost. Okay, so the Vietnam, as a result of the Geneva Treaty in Switzerland, was divided in two, kind of like the way Korea was, along a parallel. This parallel happened to be the 17th. North Vietnam was under the control of the communists, and their leader was Ho Chi Minh. And so, because of that, he was able to receive aid from his communist buddies, the Soviet Union and the Chinese. And the Americans put in control their strong man. His name was Diem. He wasn't necessarily the nicest man out there, and we'll get back into that a little bit more in just a second. The other reason why the United States became involved in Vietnam was as a result of the domino theory. It was felt that if South Vietnam fell under complete communist control, that Laos wouldn't be far behind, and then it'd be Cambodia, then it'd be Thailand, Burma, India, Bangladesh, and then pretty much Mexico would be communist, and then the United States would be in real trouble. So this is only a few decades after the appeasement debates of World War II. They have to stop the aggression before it gains too much momentum. The United States started sending a few military advisors to help prop up South Vietnam, and then under they did that under President Eisenhower, and then when Kennedy became involved, he sent some more troops, and then when Johnson came in, they started to send in a lot of troops. President Johnson did a lot of great things to the United States. Sending a lot of troops to Vietnam was not one of them. One of the things that he did was he got rid of Diem. Diem was the leader of South Vietnam, but he was not very popular. He was so unpopular that monks who hated him would burn themselves alive in protest. This was not the kind of situation that the United States wanted to see themselves in. So they ordered the CIA to get rid of Diem and replace him with a military leader named Thieu. And Thieu was in place in South Vietnam for the rest of the war. He was the definition of a capitalist strongman, a military man who was not a very nice person to his people either, but at least he hated communists more. And that's really what mattered to the United States. President Johnson's famous saying, "I don't care if he's an SOB, but as long as he's our SOB," as he said eloquently. Who were the United States fighting in Vietnam? They were fighting the Viet Cong, who were communist guerrillas in South Korea. Then they were also fighting the North Vietnamese army, who would often come down into South Vietnam to fight. They were two separate military entities. Their leaders were here. This is Ho Chi Minh pictured here, and he is the political leader of North Vietnam, and this is the North Vietnamese general. His name's General Giap. They seem to be very meek and do not seem very intimidating, but they defeated a a lot of powers, including the United States. So how would the United States defeat the Vietnamese? Well, the general in charge was General Westmoreland, and he had something called search and destroy. Now, why didn't it work? The U.S. military was to go out into the jungles and find the Viet Cong. They could only really defeat the Viet Cong. They didn't want to go into North Vietnam to fight the North Vietnamese because that would be a major escalation of the war, and they didn't want to upset the Soviet Union and China into becoming involved, kind of like the way the Korean War went a couple decades earlier. So the United States would go out in their helicopters. They'd go out in their helicopters and they'd go find, search, and destroy the enemy. If they couldn't find them, they would just drop bombs all over the jungles. And in fact, the U.S. dropped more bombs in Vietnam than they did in all of World War II. This was not a very popular strategy amongst the Vietnamese people. It did not win the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people. The United States was really good at killing people, but it made civilians in the battle areas very upset because oftentimes they would get caught in the crossfire. So the more the Americans would kill, the more recruits that the Viet Cong would get. And in the lessons that they should have learned from the French and the Japanese, was that the Vietnamese do not like being occupied, and they would fight tirelessly until they were freed. So there were a few incidents that happened that made the Americans very apprehensive about the war. The first one was the My Lai massacre. This was when a bunch of American soldiers went into villages and slaughtered a lot of civilians there. There were the napalm raids. Napalm is kind of like a jelly, flammable kind of material that burns very, very hot. This girl here, she's called the Napalm Girl. You can Google it; it's there. Had her clothes burned off. The South Vietnam regime that the United States supporting was doing very horrible things to their own people, and all of this stuff was being broadcast back to the American people. This was the first real war where the United States really knew what was going on day to day. And even this man here, his name's Walter Cronkite, he's kind of like Canada's Peter Mansbridge at the time. He was called the most trusted man in America, and even he started to turn against the war. And that became a real turning point for the United States in the war, and people turning against it. This is a picture of Kent State. It's a university in Ohio, and anti-war protests sprung up across a lot of university campuses. Kent State was just one example of one. And it was very infamous because during the protest, 5 students were killed when the Ohio National Guard opened fire on the crowd of protesters. This is also the age of hippies, peace and love, and all that stuff. The age of Woodstock. This is a picture of Woodstock here. Next, you have the real standoff between the hippies and kind of the old guard of the United States. This was a real traumatic time. You have what you have here of hippies and Woodstock and peace and love, and then you have the old classic America. So there was a real social struggle here that was going on. Now, who was eligible for the draft and who wasn't? The draft is another word for conscription. Any able-bodied man between the ages of 18 and 25 had to serve unless they went to university or college. This meant that those who could not afford to go to school had an excuse not to go to war. The result was that many African Americans, Latinos, and poor whites made up most of the U.S. Army fighting in Vietnam. Now, there were people who wanted to avoid the war, and they were called draft dodgers. And they tried actively in many ways, either by going to college or another way. So this is Muhammad Ali. He's a famous draft dodger. Another famous draft dodger here is future President Bill Clinton. He went to school instead. And the other draft dodger was George W. Bush. Now, he joined the Texas Air National Guard. So this was kind of a way of getting out of serving in Vietnam. He was protecting the skies of Texas. Next, we have President Nixon. The war was starting to grind to a halt. That nasty picture that we saw here was actually taken during what was called the Tet Offensive. Now, this was a major turning point in the war. The Viet Cong tried to stage a massive offensive against American troops. in 1968. And it was a huge battle, and the Viet Cong was absolutely annihilated by this. The Americans won, but it made the United States people realize that this war was maybe not worth it anymore because there was such opposition to them. So the Tet Offensive in 1968 was a very seminal moment in the war in Vietnam. So now we get back to Nixon. He wanted to get out. He knew that the war could not be won. So he thought that he had to find a way for the United States to withdraw their troops without having South Vietnam collapse and be conquered by the North. So how would he do it? He brought in his national security advisor. His name is Henry Kissinger. And he was able to exploit a rift between the Soviet Union and China to bring China away from Soviet influence. We're not going to get too much into it, but there was a bit of a fight between China and the Soviet Union, and now you had two communist countries that didn't like each other. And in the spirit of Bismarck, my enemy's enemy is my friend. So now we have the United States and China having a courting relationship with each other. So with this, Kissinger was able to convince China to bring North Vietnam to the negotiating table. The United States and North Vietnam agreed to a ceasefire at the Paris Peace Conference in 1973. The U.S. objective of preserving the South Vietnamese seemed to be realized at that point. Here's a picture of Mao. Mao and Kissinger got along pretty well. But then we had another turning point in the war. Nixon, the president of the United States, was fired. The way you fire a president is through an impeachment process. He was kicked out of office as a result of the Watergate scandal. I'm not going to get too much into it, but he had some people spy on some people at this hotel in Washington, D.C. He lied about it, tried to cover it up, got in trouble, and he was impeached. He was kicked out of office. And this scandal really shook Americans and the United States government to its core. Coupled with Watergate, the United States economy was fading big time. This was one of the lowest points in U.S. history since the Great Depression. Seeing the United States as wounded and not likely to come to South Vietnam's aid, the North Vietnamese successfully invaded the South and took over all of South Vietnam. And this is a picture of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon with a helicopter on top. Everyone's trying to get out. This was the picture of Gerald Ford. He was the president that replaced Nixon. He was known to be somewhat incompetent and not really know what was going on. At least that was the impression that he gave a lot of people. So if Ho Chi Minh really wanted to try to take over the South Vietnam, it was the best to do it under Gerald Ford. So what are the real costs of the war and what impact did it have on American future politics? A lot of American leaders today were involved in the Vietnam War. This is a young sergeant in the United States military. His name is Chuck Hagel. He would later become the Secretary of Defense for the United States. We have here a young John Kerry, and he's now the Secretary of State for the United States in the Obama administration. There's still a lot of Americans that are supposedly still missing. POW, prisoner of war, and MIA is missing in action. You're never forgotten. So there's an idea out there that there's still American soldiers who didn't come home but aren't dead, who are still in a prison camp in the United States. And there's still Americans who believe that these people are still there. So Vietnam was conquered, right? The South Vietnamese were now under control of the North, so it was just one Vietnam. And Saigon, which was the capital of South Vietnam, then became named Ho Chi Minh City. Now, what were the social, economic, political, and strategic and military results of the war? The American people were torn apart. So this was the major social contribution of the war, that it really split the country. The American people were torn. Vietnam was just one issue among many in the 1960s and 1970s. Like, we haven't even gotten into civil rights yet. So this was just one of the major things that was going on at the time. Economically, the war cost the United States a fortune. The United States went into a near decade-long recession as a result of the war. Politically, Johnson's presidency was ruined. He did so much for civil rights and the Great Society, but he will always be remembered for Vietnam. Strategically, for the next 30 years, the Americans would not be involved in a major land war, and the United States was no longer seen as invincible. The United States were still the top dog in Asia, but China was now rising. American power had to be rethought, and the U.S. dropped, and especially because since the United States dropped more bombs in Vietnam than they did during World War II, and they were still unable to win. And at a military cost, they had 60,000 dead, and many more were wounded physically and psychologically as a result of the war. Now, is there any sense of irony associated with Vietnam and the Vietnam War given the current state of affairs and in political affairs and economic in Vietnam? Well, what did the United States do? The United States went to war to preserve the South Vietnamese country against communist aggression and to keep capitalism going and all that stuff. But now if you look at Vietnam, it is a capitalist place. A lot of t-shirts are made in Vietnam. A lot of multinational corporations are there. This is a picture in Vietnam of Coca-Cola, the most American of all corporations, and they're there. So what did the United States really fight for? And in fact, now Vietnam is a key U.S. ally in Asia. So what really did the United States fight for? That's a real question that people are still trying to answer. Now, what effects did the Vietnam War have on Canada? A lot of draft dodgers came north of the border. Some Canadians also were going the other way. Some Canadians wanted the experience and the war and the adventure, so they joined the U.S. Army to fight in Vietnam. A lot of people did that. With the United States being at war, it gave Canadians a real sense of being a peaceful country in North America. Even prime ministers like Pearson and Trudeau were very much against the war in Vietnam, and they were very much hated by Presidents Johnson and Nixon because of it. So that concludes our video about Vietnam. Stay tuned for Afghanistan in the next video.